They say there are places in the deep South that history forgot, but that never forget. In the marshlands of South Carolina, 12 miles outside of Charleston, there was a plantation known only by locals, Western Grove. By 1891, it had been abandoned for over 30 years, its fields reclaimed by wild grass and bramble, its manor house a hollowed shell. Yet every single night, without fail, witnesses reported 17 distinct lights moving through the upper windows, not the flicker of fireflies, not the reflection of the moon, steady, deliberate candlelight, as if the house were still occupied. Local authorities dismissed the reports. The Charleston Post refused to print testimonies. Families who owned neighboring land spoke of it only in whispers, and a county ordinance quietly forbade anyone from entering the property after dusk. The records of what happened at Western Grove was sealed, then lost, then deliberately destroyed. Tonight, you'll discover what those lights were and why no one wanted the truth to come out. Before we continue with the story of Western Grove and the family that vanished there, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, from which state or city are you listening? Let's uncover this mystery together. What you're about to hear began not in 1891, but decades earlier in the sweltering heat of a South Carolina summer. The year was 1858, and Western Grove was not yet a ruin. It was a thriving rice plantation, one of many, along the Ashley River basin that fed Charleston's wealth. The estate sprawled across 800 acres of rich bottomland, its fields tended by nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children. The manor itself was an elegant three-story structure built in the Greek Revival style. White columns, wide verandas, and tall windows that caught every breath of wind during the brutal summers. The plantation was owned by Nathaniel Weston, a third-generation planter whose family had accumulated land and influence since the 1780s. Nathaniel was 42 years old in 1858. Man of slender build and nervous energy, known in Charleston social circles for his fastidiousness and his temper. He had inherited Western Grove from his father 10 years prior, and though the yields were good, Nathaniel was perpetually anxious, obsessed with efficiency, with order, with control. He lived at Western Grove with his wife Catherine, a quiet woman from a Virginia tobacco family, and their 3 children, Margaret, 15, Thomas, 12, and Anne, just 8 years old. Catherine had grown pale and withdrawn over the years, rarely venturing into Charleston anymore, spending most of her days in the upstairs parlor with her needlework. The children were educated at home by a stern tutor from Boston named Mr. Gaines, a man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a ruler he used too often, but the true engine of Western Grove was not the Western family. It was the labor of the enslaved, overseen by Mr. Horus Drummond, the plantation's overseer. Drummond was a thick-shouldered man from the Georgia back country, a man with a reputation. He had worked on plantations from Savannah to the Corollas, and wherever he went, productivity increased, but so did the silence. Workers stopped singing in the fields. Mothers clutched their children tighter at night. Drummond never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. By the summer of 1858, there were whispers among the enslaved community at Western Grove. Whispers about people disappearing, not escaping north. Disappearing. A young man named Caleb, who had tried to run in May, was brought back. He was seen being taken to the overseer's house at dusk. He was never seen again. Drummond claimed he'd been sold downriver, but no bill of sale was ever recorded. Then there was Dinah, a woman in her 20s who had spoken back to Drummond in the rice fields. She too vanished one night. Again, Drummond said she'd been sold. Again, no documentation. The enslaved workers at Western Grove began to believe that something darker was happening. There were stories, always, spoken in low voices, always after Drummond had written out, that beneath the overseer's cottage there was a root cellar, and that the root cellar had a second door, and that the second door led somewhere no one came back from. Nathaniel Weston, for his part, saw none of this, or chose not to see it. He spent his days in his study, poring over ledgers and production reports. His rice harvests were among the best in the region. His profits were climbing. Whatever Drummond did to maintain discipline, Nathaniel did not ask. In the brutal economy of 1858 South Carolina, results were all that mattered. But Catherine noticed the faces of the women who worked in the house, how they flinched when Drummond's name was mentioned, how they avoided his gaze when he came to speak with Nathaniel. She noticed that certain people were no longer there, and when she asked, she received only vague answers. One evening in late July she asked Nathaniel directly, "Where is Dina?" Nathaniel barely looked up from his papers. "Sold to whom?" "I don't manage those details. Drummond handles it." Catherine's hands tightened around her embroidery hoop. "There's no record." Nathaniel's eyes finally met hers, cold and warning. "Drandles it," he repeated. And that was the end of the conversation. But it was not the end of Catherine's suspicions. She began to watch. She began to notice patterns, and she began to write things down in a small leather journal she kept hidden in her wardrobe. By September of 1858, nearly a dozen people from Western Grove's enslaved population had vanished. No sales, no transfers, just gone. The remaining workers moved through their days like ghosts, eyes down, voices muted. The fields were silent except for the rhythmic sound of hoes in the earth, and the distant cry of herons in the marsh. And then came the night of September 14th. The air that evening was thick and still, the kind of oppressive heat that made breathing feel like labor. The sun set behind the trees in streaks of orange and red, and as darkness settled over Western Grove, the usual sounds of the plantation, the low hum of evening chores, the crackle of cooking fires, began to fade. Catherine was upstairs in the children's room, reading to and by candlelight. Through the open window, she heard the faint sound of voices raised in argument. She paused, tilting her head. The voices were coming from the direction of the overseer's cottage, about 200 yards from the main house. One voice was Drummond's, low, steady, menacing. The other was higher, desperate. A woman's voice. Catherine set the book down. "Stay here," she told Anne, and stepped into the hallway. From the landing she could see Nathaniel in his study on the first floor, door closed. The house was quiet. Catherine moved to the far window at the end of the hall, the one that faced the overseer's cottage. In the dim moonlight she could make out two figures near the cottage entrance. Drummond, unmistakable in his broad silhouette, and a woman, Esther, one of the houseworkers, a woman in her 30s with a young daughter. Catherine couldn't hear the words, but she could see the fear in Esther's posture, the way she was backing away, shaking her head. Drummond took a step forward. Esther turned to run, and then Drummond grabbed her by the arm and pulled her inside. Catherine's breath caught. She stood frozen at the window, her heart pounding. Minutes passed. The cottage remained dark. No one came out. She wanted to go downstairs to tell Nathaniel to demand he do something, but she knew. She knew what he would say. "Drummond handles it." She felt a sickening knot of complicity forming in her chest. She returned to Anne's room, sat back down, and tried to continue reading, but the words swam on the page. And, sensing her mother's distraction, asked if something was wrong. "No, darling," Catherine whispered. "Everything is fine." But everything was not fine. The next morning, Esther was gone. Her daughter, a girl of 7, named Ruby, was found wandering the quarters, crying, asking for her mother. When the other women tried to console her, she kept repeating the same thing. Mr. Drummond took her. Mr. Drummond took her. Nathaniel was informed. He summoned Drummond to the house. Catherine listened from the top of the stairs. The woman Esther Nathaniel said, "Where is she?" "Sold, sir." Drummond replied smoothly. "Trader came through last night. Got a good price." At night he was passing through. Didn't want to wait till morning. There was a pause. Then Nathaniel's voice quieter. And the child? Too young to sell with the mother. She'll be put to work in a few years. Another pause. Then fine, that will be all. Catherine's hands gripped the banister until her knuckles went white. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay beside Nathaniel in the dark, listening to his steady breathing, and made a decision. She would find out what was happening. She would find out where those people were going. 3 nights later, Catherine waited until the house was silent. Nathaniel was asleep. The children were asleep. The house staff had retreated to the quarters. She dressed in a dark shawl, took a candle, and slipped out the back door. The night was warm and humid, the air thick with the smell of earth and river water. Crickets sang in relentless waves. Catherine moved carefully across the yard, her candle shielded toward the overseer's cottage. The windows were dark. Drummond was not there. She had watched him ride out toward Charleston that afternoon, and had not seen him return. She approached the cottage slowly, her pulse racing. The front door was locked, but she knew there was a side entrance used for deliveries. She tried the latch. It gave. Inside, the cottage was sparsely furnished, a table, a chair, a narrow bed, a faint smell of tobacco and sweat. Catherine moved to the back room where she knew the root cellar entrance was. She lifted the wooden hatch in the floor. Stone steps descended into darkness. She hesitated, then started down, holding her candle before her. The cellar was small and cool, lined with shelves holding jars of preserved vegetables and sacks of grain. But at the far end, behind a stack of crates, Catherine saw what she was looking for, a second door, rough hewn wood, fitted with a heavy iron latch. She set the candle down and pulled the latch. The door swung inward. Beyond it was not another room. It was a tunnel, narrow, low ceiling. The walls shored up with timber and stone. The air that came out was cold and damp, carrying a smell that made her stomach turn. Earth, mildew, and something else, something rotten. Catherine picked up her candle and stepped inside. The tunnel sloped gently downward from the cottage. She moved slowly, one hand on the wall for balance. After about 50 feet, the passage widened into a small chamber. And there, in the candlelight, Catherine saw them. Chains bolted into the stone walls, a wooden bench stained dark tools, iron implements whose purpose she did not want to imagine. And in the corner, a pile of cloth. She stepped closer, her candle trembling in her hand. Not cloth, clothing. A dress she recognized, a shirt, a pair of shoes. Her breath came in short gasps. This was where they had been taken. This was where they had ended. And then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, from a direction she had not yet explored, she heard a sound, a faint rhythmic scraping. Metal on stone. Catherine's candle nearly slipped from her hand. She turned, every instinct screaming at her to run, but the sound came again, closer now. Not random, deliberate. Someone or something was down here with her. She bolted. She ran back through the tunnel, up the cellar steps, out of the cottage, across the yard, and into the main house. She slammed the door behind her, locked it, and stood in the darkened hallway, shaking, her candle extinguished. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her room, the journal open on her lap, writing down everything she had seen. The next morning, Catherine confronted Nathaniel. She told him what she had found. She demanded he dismiss Drummond, contact the authorities, do something. Nathaniel's face went gray. He did not deny it. He did not defend Drummond. He simply said in a voice barely above a whisper, "If you speak of this to anyone, we will lose everything. The plantation, our name, the children's future. Do you understand?" Catherine stared at him. "People are being murdered, Nathaniel. They are property," he said flatly. "And property can be disposed of." It was the first time Catherine truly understood the man she had married. She did not speak of it to anyone, but she could not let it stand. Over the following weeks, Catherine began to quietly gather evidence, names, dates, anything that might prove what was happening. She confided in no one, not even the house staff, fearing word would reach Drummond. She planned to take her journal to Charleston to a lawyer she knew, a man who had once spoken against the worst excesses of the slave system, but she never got the chance. On the night of October 9, 1858, Western Grove burned. The fire started in the overseer's cottage just after midnight. By the time anyone noticed, the flames had already leapt to the main house, racing up the dry wooden siding and engulfing the eastern wing in minutes. Nathaniel, Catherine, and the children barely escaped, fleeing into the yard in their nightclothes as the house became an inferno. The enslaved workers formed a bucket line from the well, but it was hopeless. The heat was too intense, the flames too high. By dawn, both the manor house and the overseer's cottage were reduced to smoking ruins. Drummond was found dead in the wreckage of his cottage, burned beyond recognition. The official report stated that he had likely been asleep when the fire started, overcome by smoke. Nathaniel, Catherine, and the children survived, but they were left with almost nothing. The house was gone. The records were gone. The stored rice from the last harvest gone. And Catherine's journal, the one she had hidden in her wardrobe, was ash. Within days, Nathaniel moved his family to Charleston, taking temporary lodgings with Catherine's distant cousin. He attempted to rebuild, to secure loans, to salvage what remained of the plantation. But the debts were overwhelming and the insurance payout was delayed by questions about the fire's origin. Rumors began to circulate. Whispers that the fire had been deliberate, set by one of the enslaved workers as an act of revenge. An investigation was launched, but it went nowhere. No one would testify. No evidence of arson was found. The case was quietly closed. Nathaniel never returned to Western Grove. He sold what remained of the land to a Charleston merchant in 1859 for a fraction of its value, and the family moved to Augusta, Georgia, where Nathaniel's health rapidly declined. He died in 1861, just as the Civil War began, of what doctors called nervous exhaustion. Catherine and the children moved north after the war, settling in Philadelphia, where they lived in modest obscurity. Catherine never spoke of Western Grove again, but the land itself did not remain quiet. In the years following the fire, locals began to report strange occurrences at the ruins. The plantation was abandoned, the fields overgrown, the charred remains of the manor slowly collapsing into the earth. Yet travelers, passing along the nearby river road at night, claimed to see lights in the upper windows, or rather where the upper windows had been. Candles, they said, moving from room to room as if someone were walking through the house. First, the stories were dismissed as imagination or the reflection of lanterns from distant homesteads. But the reports were too consistent, too specific. 17 lights, always the same number, always in the same slow, deliberate pattern, starting at the eastern side of the house, moving through what had been the hallway, then the western rooms, then down to the ground floor. Every night, without fail, from dusk until just before dawn. By the 1870s, Western Grove had gained a reputation. It became a place locals avoided after dark. The new owner, the Charleston merchant, attempted to develop the land, but found no one willing to work there. Laborers he hired refused to stay past sunset. Some claimed they heard sounds coming from the ruins, faint voices, a woman crying, footsteps on floors that no longer existed. In 1873, the merchant hired a crew to demolish the remaining structure entirely to clear the site and make it usable. The crew worked for 3 days, tearing down the charred walls, hauling away debris. On the 4th day they refused to continue. The foreman, a man named Augustus Finch, reported that while working in the cellar, they had uncovered a sealed door leading to a tunnel beneath the house. When they opened it, the smell was so overwhelming that 2 men vomited on the spot. Finch ordered the tunnel sealed immediately and quit the job that same afternoon. The merchant, frustrated and unnerved, abandoned the project. Western Grove remained a ruin and the lights continued. By the 1880s, the phenomenon had become local legend. Stories spread through Charleston and the surrounding parishes. Some said the lights were the spirits of the Western family, doomed to relive the night of the fire. Others claimed it was the enslaved dead wandering the ruins in search of justice. A few whispered darker theories that something had been done at Western Grove, something so terrible that the land itself could not forget. But no one investigated. No one wanted to know. That changed in 1891 when a young journalist from Charleston named Peter Kavanaugh decided to spend a night at Western Grove and document what he saw. Peter Kavanaugh was 26 years old, ambitious and hungry for a story that would make his name. He had been writing for the Charleston Ledger for 3 years, mostly covering city council meetings and shipping news, but he wanted something bigger. When he heard about the lights at Western Grove, he saw his opportunity. He approached his editor, Mr. Leonard Hayes, with the idea: spend a night at the ruins, document the lights, interview locals, and publish a full expose. Hayes was skeptical. No one cares about ghost stories, Kavanaugh. But Peter was persistent. He argued that the mystery had persisted for over 30 years, that there had to be a rational explanation, and that uncovering it would be a genuine public service. Finally, Hayes relented. One night, he said, if you find nothing, you drop it. Peter agreed. He spent 2 weeks preparing. He interviewed locals in the villages near Western Grove collecting testimonies. An elderly fisherman named Josiah who worked the river claimed he saw the lights clear as Sunday morning every night same time. A woman named Mrs. Pauline Vickers, who lived on a neighboring farm, said her late husband had seen them too and had once tried to approach the house to investigate, but something had stopped him. He said he felt wrong. She told Peter like the air itself didn't want him there. Peter also visited the Charleston County Records Office, searching for information about the Weston family and the fire. He found very little. The fire was listed as accidental, cause unknown. Nathaniel Weston's estate sale was recorded, but there were no details about the plantation's operations, no mention of Drummond, and curiously, no record of any enslaved persons being transferred or sold from Western Grove after the fire. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist on paper. Peter found that absence more disturbing than any ghost story. On the evening of October 12, 1891, 33 years and 3 days after the fire, Peter Kavanaugh arrived at Western Grove just before sunset. He came equipped with a notebook, pencils, a pocket watch, a lantern, matches, a flask of whiskey, and a revolver. He wasn't entirely sure how to use. The ruins were more extensive than he had imagined. The main structure was a skeleton. Blackened support beams, sections of collapsed wall, the stone chimney still standing like a grave marker. Vegetation had overtaken most of it. Vines crawled up the remaining walls and saplings grew through cracks in the foundation. The air smelled of rot and river mud. Peter set up his position on a low stone wall about 50 yards from the house, where he had a clear view of the ruins. He lit his lantern, opened his notebook, and waited. The sun sank below the horizon. Darkness fell. The marsh came alive with the sound of frogs and insects. Peter noted the time, 7:14 p.m. At exactly 7:30, the first light appeared. It was in what would have been an upper window on the eastern side of the house. A soft, warm glow. Candle light unmistakable. Peter's hand tightened around his pencil. He wrote quickly. First light, east wing, second floor. 7:30 p.m. 30 seconds later, a second light appeared in the next window. Then a third. They moved slowly, steadily, as if someone were walking through the house carrying a candle. Peter's pulse quickened. He counted them as they appeared one by one, progressing along the upper floor. When the count reached 17, they began to descend, appearing now in the ground floor windows, or where the windows had been. The pattern was precise, unhurried. Peter stood, lifting his lantern, and moved closer. His journalistic skepticism weared with the hair standing up on the back of his neck. There had to be an explanation. Reflected light from somewhere. Phosphorescence in the wood. Swamp gas. But the lights did not waver. They did not flicker. They moved with intention. When Peter was within 20 yards of the house, he stopped. The temperature had dropped noticeably, not the gradual cooling of evening, but a sudden, unnatural chill. His breath misted in the air, and beneath the sound of the marsh, he heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, walking. Across a wooden floor, but there was no floor. Peter's rational mind tried to supply explanations, an animal, the settling of old timbers, but his body was already retreating, stepping backward, his heart hammering in his chest. And then he heard the voice, a woman's voice, faint and distant, calling out, "Please." Not a howl, not a shriek, just a single word spoken with utter desperation. Peter ran. He didn't stop until he reached the road nearly a quarter-mile away, where he collapsed against a tree. Gasping, he looked back toward the ruins. The lights were still there, moving through their pattern, indifferent to his presence. He stayed on the road for the rest of the night, watching from a distance, recording every detail. The lights continued until just before dawn, then vanished as the first gray light touched the sky. Peter returned to Charleston the next morning, exhausted and shaken, but convinced he had a story. Peter's article ran in the Charleston Ledger on October 18, 1891. Under the headline, "The Western Grove Mystery, Lights, Voices, and Unanswered Questions." It was a sensation. The article detailed his experience, the testimonies of locals, and the curious gaps in the historical record. Peter stopped short of claiming anything supernatural. He framed it as an unexplained phenomenon worthy of scientific investigation. The response was immediate. Letters poured into the Ledger's offices, some from readers sharing their own experiences near Western Grove, others from skeptics demanding Peter retract what they called sensationalist nonsense. A professor from the College of Charleston wrote to suggest the lights were a natural phenomenon related to decaying organic matter. A pastor from a Baptist church wrote to condemn the article as blasphemous, claiming Peter was stirring up old evils better left buried. But the most significant response came from Mrs. Margaret Weston Curran. Margaret, the eldest daughter of Nathaniel and Catherine, was now 48 years old, living in Baltimore with her husband, a banker. She wrote to Peter directly, care of the newspaper, requesting a private meeting. Peter, astonished, agreed immediately. They met in a hotel parlor in Charleston on a gray afternoon in late October. Margaret was a composed, dignified woman with prematurely silver hair and sharp eyes. She ordered tea, exchanged pleasantries, and then got to the point. "You wrote about Western Grove," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You saw the lights." "I did." Margaret was silent for a long moment, stirring her tea. Then, "My mother saw them, too." Peter blinked. "I'm sorry." "Before the fire," Margaret continued, her voice measured. "In the weeks before the fire, my mother became convinced that something terrible was happening on the plantation. She would stand at the windows at night watching the overseer's cottage. She wrote things down. I was 15. I didn't understand it then, but I remember her fear." "Do you know what she found?" Margaret hesitated. "She never told me directly, but I heard her arguing with my father. She wanted him to dismiss the overseer, a man named Drummond. My father refused, and then the fire happened." "Do you think the fire was deliberate?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that my mother believed it was the only way to stop what was happening." Peter felt a chill run through him. You saying your mother started the fire?" "I'm saying," Margaret replied, "that she died believing she had done the right thing, and that my father died knowing he had done nothing." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table between them. "This belonged to my mother. I found it among her things after she passed in 1884. Peter unwrapped it. Inside was a key. Old iron. Heavy. "What does it open?" "I don't know," Margaret said, "but it was the only thing she kept from Western Grove. She carried it with her for the rest of her life." Peter looked at the key, then at Margaret. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the lights are still there," Margaret said quietly. 33 years after the fire, and they're still there. I need to know why. I need to know what my mother found." Peter left the meeting with the key in his pocket and a new resolve. He would return to Western Grove, but this time he would go into the ruins. He recruited 2 companions for the expedition: Samuel Porter, a photographer and fellow journalist, and Dr. Edwin Marsh, a physician with an interest in what he called psychological phenomena. Peter did not tell them everything Margaret had shared, only that he believed there was a physical explanation for the lights and that he intended to find it. They arrived at Western Grove on the evening of October 30th, equipped with lanterns, rope, shovels, and Samuel's camera equipment. The plan was simple: wait for the lights to appear, then enter the ruins and search for their source. The lights appeared on schedule. Just after 7:30, 17 of them moving through their familiar pattern. Peter, Samuel, and Dr. Marsh approached the house cautiously, their lanterns casting long shadows across the scorched beams and fallen masonry. Close, the effect was even more unnerving. The lights seemed to come from within the structure, as if the walls that had burned away were somehow still there, still holding rooms and hallways that no longer existed. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Marsh murmured. "I've read about such things, but never witnessed." "Where's the cellar entrance?" Peter interrupted, consulting a rough map he had drawn based on descriptions from former workers. They found it on the western side of the ruins, partially collapsed, but still accessible. Peter used the key Margaret had given him, though there was no longer a door to unlock, just a gap in the rubble leading down into darkness. They descended carefully. The air below was cold and stagnant, thick with the smell of earth and decay. Their lanterns revealed a stone-walled space, mostly intact, filled with debris from the collapse above. And at the far end, just as Catherine had described, they found the second door, partially buried, but still visible. It took them nearly an hour to clear the rubble. When they finally pulled the door open, the smell that emerged made all 3 men recoil. Samuel gagged. "Doctor!" Marsh covered his mouth with a handkerchief. "God in heaven!" Peter whispered. Beyond the door, the tunnel stretched into darkness. They moved forward slowly, the walls pressing close. After about 60 feet, they reached the chamber. It was exactly as Catherine had seen it. The chains, the bench, the tools. But there was more now. In 33 years, the earth had shifted, and part of the tunnel wall had collapsed inward, revealing what had been hidden behind. Bones. Human remains partially buried in the earthen floor. Not one, not 2, many. Dr. Marsh knelt, examining them with clinical detachment despite the horror of the scene. "These have been here for decades," he said quietly. "Buried in quicklime, I'd guess to accelerate decomposition. Whoever did this tried to erase evidence." "How many?" Peter asked, his voice. Marsh shook his head. "I can't say for certain without proper excavation, but at least a dozen, possibly more." Samuel had gone pale. "We need to contact the authorities." "The authorities knew," Peter said bitterly, thinking of the sealed records, the dismissed reports, or they chose not to. "No." They spent another hour documenting the scene. Samuel attempted to photograph the chamber, though the low light made it difficult. Peter took meticulous notes. Dr. Marsh carefully examined the remains, trying to determine ages, causes of death. And then, as they were preparing to leave, Peter noticed something. On the far side of the chamber, partially hidden beneath fallen earth, there was another passage, narrower than the first, leading not back toward the overseer's cottage, but in the opposite direction, toward where the main house had stood. Peter moved toward it, holding his lantern high. "Kavanaugh, we should go," Samuel said, nervously. But Peter was already stepping into the passage. It was low. He had to crouch, and it angled upward. The walls rough, hewn stone and clay. After about 40 feet, it ended in a vertical shaft lined with brick. A chimney, Peter realized, or something, meant to look like one. He climbed carefully, bracing his feet against the walls until he emerged into what had been the basement of the main house. The space above was open to the sky now, the floors having collapsed in the fire, but the foundation remained. And in the center of the foundation, Peter saw something that made his blood run cold. 17 stone markers, small, uniform, arranged in a precise grid. Not gravestones. They bore no names, no dates, just smooth river stones, each about the size of a fist, placed with deliberate care. Peter stood among them, his lantern casting flickering light across the ruins, and understood the lights were not random. They were not reflections or swamp gas or imagination. They were 17 people, 17 souls whose deaths had been hidden, whose bodies had been buried in secret, whose existence had been erased from every official record. And every night the lights appeared in the pattern they would have walked in life. Through the house, down the stairs, toward the cellar, toward the tunnel that had been their grave. Peter climbed out of the ruins, his hands shaking. He rejoined Samuel and Dr. Marsh, and together they left Western Grove as the first light of dawn touched the sky. Behind them the lights faded. But the question remained who had placed those 17 stones and when. Peter published his findings in a follow-up article on November 5, 1891. Western Grove revealed evidence of concealed deaths. This time he did not hold back. He detailed the tunnel, the remains, the 17 markers. He called for an official investigation for the exhumation of the site for justice delayed, but not denied. The reaction was swift and hostile. The Charleston Ledger was inundated with letters, not of support, but of outrage. Prominent Charleston families, many of whom had ties to the old plantation economy, accused Peter of defaming the dead, of stirring up sectional hatreds best left in the past. One letter signed by a coalition of former planters threatened legal action if Peter continued to slander the memory of respectable families. Peter's editor, Leonard Hayes, called him into his office. "You need to stop," Hayes said. "Bluntly. Stop. We found human remains, dozens of them. And you think anyone wants to dig that up?" Hayes shot back. "The war ended 26 years ago. Reconstruction is over. The city is trying to move forward. No one wants to be reminded of what happened on those plantations. People were murdered," Peter said, his voice rising. "That doesn't just go away because it's inconvenient." Hayes sighed. "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you're alone. The authorities won't touch this. The families won't cooperate. And if you keep pushing, you'll lose your job." Peter left the office furious, but he knew Hayes was right. He had no allies, no official support. The story was already being buried again, but he wasn't ready to give up. He wrote to Margaret Weston Curran describing what he had found. Her response arrived a week later. She was horrified, but not surprised. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to distance myself from Western Grove," she wrote. "But if what you found is true, then my mother's fears were justified. I will help you however I can." She sent Peter a packet of letters and documents she had kept, correspondence between her parents, fragments of financial records, and a partial list of names. Enslaved individuals who had lived at Western Grove in 1858. Peter Cross referenced the names with the records he had found. 13 of the names had no record of sale or transfer after 1858. They had simply vanished from the books. Peter now had evidence of concealment, but he still didn't have the full story. He decided to search for survivors, anyone who had Been at Weston Grove before the fire and might still be alive. It was a long shot. More than 3 decades had passed, but he placed notices in newspapers across South Carolina and Georgia asking for information. In early December, he received a response. A woman named Hannah was living in a freed men's community outside of Savannah. She was in her 60s now, but she had been enslaved at Western Grove as a young woman in the 1850s. She had been sold to a plantation in Georgia in 1857, a year before the fire, and had survived the war to build a new life. She was willing to speak to Peter. He took the train to Savannah and met her in the modest clapboard church where she worshipped. Hannah was small and thin, her hair wrapped in a faded blue scarf, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, but her eyes were sharp, and her memory was clear. "You want to know about Western Grove?" she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Hannah looked out the window toward the winter sky. "I don't like to speak of it, but I suppose it's time." She told him about Drummond, about the disappearances, about the fear that had settled over the plantation like a shroud. People would be there one day, gone the next, she said. Drummond would say they'd been sold. But we knew. We knew it was a lie. You could see it in his eyes. He enjoyed it. "Did you ever see the tunnel?" Peter asked gently. Hannah shook her head. "But I heard about it. There was a boy, Jacob, who worked in the overseer's cottage sometimes, cleaning and such. He told me he'd seen a door in the cellar. Said Drummond warned him never to speak of it or he'd end up on the other side of it." "What happened to Jacob?" "Gone," Hannah said simply. 2 weeks after he told me. Drummond said he'd run off. But Jacob wasn't a fool. He wouldn't have run. He had family. Do you remember? How many people disappeared?" Hannah closed her eyes, her lips moving silently as she counted. When she opened them, her expression was haunted. 17, she said. "That I knew of. There may have been more." Peter felt the weight of confirmation settle over him. "Do you know what happened the night of the fire?" Anna was quiet for a long time. "Then I wasn't there, but I heard things. Later, folks who stayed said the fire started in Drummond's cottage. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was set deliberate. By whom?" Hannah met his eyes. "There was a woman, one of the houseworkers, Esther. She had a daughter, Ruby. Esther disappeared just a few weeks before the fire. Ruby was left behind. She was just a child, but she knew. She knew what had happened to her mother." Peter's breath caught. "You think Ruby started the fire?" "I think," Hannah said slowly, "that Ruby wasn't the only one who wanted Drummond dead. And I think that when that fire started, no one tried very hard to put it out." Peter left Savannah with more questions than answers. He now knew the names of the victims, the scope of the horror, and the likelihood that the fire had been an act of desperate justice. But he still didn't know who had placed the 17 stones, and he didn't know why the lights appeared. He returned to Western Grove one final time in mid-December. Alone. He needed to see the markers again to understand their placement. He arrived at dusk and waited. The lights appeared as always at 7:30. Peter watched their pattern carefully, comparing it to the layout of the house as he understood it. The lights moved through the upper floor, what had been the family quarters, then down to the ground floor, the parlor, the dining room, then toward the back of the house, toward the cellar. Ear descended into the ruins again, following the path of the lights. He reached the foundation where the 17 stones were placed and knelt among them, his lantern illuminating their smooth surfaces, and then he noticed something he had missed before. The stones were not placed randomly. They were arranged in a specific pattern, a pattern that, when viewed from above, formed the rough outline of a room. The dimensions matched the chamber in the tunnel. The stones marked where the bodies had been laid. Someone had come here after the fire, someone who knew, someone who had counted the dead and marked their graves. Peter's mind raced. Who would have had the knowledge, the access, the reason? Not Nathaniel. He had fled and never returned. Not Drummond. He was dead. Not the enslaved workers. Most had been scattered after the fire, sold or freed into uncertainty. But Catherine. Catherine had known. Catherine had been in the tunnel before the fire. Catherine had written everything down. And Catherine had survived. Peter thought of Margaret's words. My mother died believing she had done the right thing. He thought of the key Margaret had given him, the key Catherine had carried for the rest of her life, and he understood. Peter returned to Baltimore and requested another meeting with Margaret. This time he brought everything, his notes, the photographs, Hannah's testimony, the list of names. He laid it all out before her in her sitting room. Your mother placed the stones, he said. Margaret's face was unreadable. What makes you think that? Because she was the only one who knew. She was in the tunnel before the fire. She saw what Drummond had done. And after the fire, after your family left, she came back. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, she did. Peter leaned forward. Tell me. Margaret rose and walked to the window, looking out at the winter street. My mother never recovered from what she saw at Western Grove, she began. After we moved to Philadelphia, she became hollow. She barely spoke. Rarely left the house, but once a year, every year, she would disappear for a week. She told us she was visiting an old friend in Virginia. I didn't question it. I was young and I had my own life, but she wasn't going to Virginia. No. Margaret turned back to Peter. After she died, I found letters in her belongings, train tickets, receipts from a boarding house in Charleston. She had been going back to Western Grove every year on the same date, October 9th, the anniversary of the fire. Why? Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. To remember them, to bear witness, because no one else would. Peter felt a lump in his throat. The stones. She placed them the first year she returned in 1859. She went into the ruins alone, found the tunnel, and counted the remains. 17. She marked each one. And every year after, she came back to make sure the markers were still there. She brought candles. She lit them, one for each. She walked the pattern they would have walked through the house, down to the cellar, to the place where they died. Peter's hands trembled as he wrote. The lights, he said, barely breathing. The lights are my mother's vigil, Margaret finished. 17 candles lit in remembrance every October 9th. But your mother died in 1884, Peter said. The lights have continued since then. I saw them just last month. Margaret met his eyes, and for the first time her composure cracked. I know. Then who? I don't know, Margaret said, her voice breaking. That's what terrifies me. My mother is gone, but someone is still lighting those candles. Peter returned to Charleston and went to the county clerk's office. He requested all records related to Western Grove for the past decade. The clerk, an elderly man named Mr. Tobias Fletcher, seemed reluctant, but Peter was persistent. Finally, Fletcher produced a slim file. Inside was a single deed transfer dated 1885, 1 year after Catherine's death. Western Grove had been purchased by a woman named Ruby Vance. Peter's heart stopped. Ruby, Esther's daughter, the girl who had watched Drummond take her mother. He found Ruby's address listed in the Savannah City directory. She was living in a small house on the outskirts of the city, working as a seamstress. Peter took the train south once more. Ruby answered the door herself. She was in her early 40s, a tall, quiet woman, with careful eyes. When Peter introduced himself and mentioned Western Grove, she did not look surprised. I've been expecting someone, she said. Come in. They sat in her modest parlor. Ruby served coffee. Peter explained everything. His investigation, his meeting with Margaret, the 17 stones, the lights. Ruby listened without interruption. When he finished, she said simply, "Mrs. Weston came to find me in 1859. Peter blinked. "Catherine, yes, she found me in Charleston, where I'd been placed with a new household after the fire. She told me what she had discovered. She told me about my mother, and she told me she intended to remember. She brought you to Western Grove." Ruby nodded. "Just once that first year she showed me the tunnel, the stones. She said she would come back every year to light candles, and that when I was free, if I chose, I could continue." "And you did?" "Yes." Ruby's voice was steady, but her hands tightened around her cup. "I bought the land in 1885 with money I had saved. It took me years, but I wanted to make sure no one could build there could disturb them. And I wanted to keep Mrs. Weston's vigil. Every year, every night," Peter stared at her. "Every night," Ruby met his eyes. 17 people died in that tunnel. 17 souls erased from the world as if they never existed. The least I can do is make sure they're remembered. So yes, every night. I travel from Savannah. I light 17 candles. I walk the path they would have walked, and I sit with them until dawn." Peter struggled to find words, but the lights appear at the same time every evening. You can't be there every single night. Ruby's expression didn't change. "I've hired others, freed men and women who knew what was done, who wanted to help. We take turns. There is always someone there. There will always be someone there." Peter felt a profound sense of awe and sorrow. "The authorities. They must know by now." "They do," Ruby said quietly. "I wrote to the county sheriff in 1886 explaining what I'd found, requesting a formal investigation. He never responded. I wrote to the governor. No response. I went to a lawyer. He told me that even if everything I said was true, no charges could be brought because Drummond was dead and Nathaniel Weston was dead, and there were no witnesses willing to testify. So you continued the vigil. It's all I can do." Peter sat back, his mind reeling. "I'm going to publish this," he said. "All of it. The truth." Ruby's smile was sad. "You can try." Peter's final article, "The Truth of Western Grove, A Monument to the Forgotten," was submitted to the Charleston Ledger on December 20th, 1891. It detailed everything: the tunnel, the remains, Catherine's vigil, Ruby's continuation of it. It named names, cited evidence, and called for a formal exhumation and investigation. Leonard Hayes refused to print it. "I'm sorry, Peter," Hayes said, "but this will destroy the paper. We'll be sued into oblivion. No one wants this story." Peter tried other newspapers in Charleston, then Columbia, then Atlanta. Refused. Finally, a small abolitionist newsletter based in Boston agreed to publish it, but their circulation was minimal, their influence negligible. The story appeared, was read by a few hundred people, and then faded into obscurity. No official investigation was ever launched. The remains at Western Grove were never exhumed. The tunnel was never formally documented. The 17 stones remained in place, unmarked and unacknowledged. Peter Kavanaugh left journalism in 1892, disillusioned and exhausted. He became a schoolteacher in North Carolina, where he spent the rest of his life. He never wrote about Western Grove again. Ruby Vance continued the vigil until her death in 1923 at the age of 72. In her will, she left Western Grove to a trust with explicit instructions that the land never be developed and that the evening watch continue. The trust, managed by members of the local black church, honored her wishes. Volunteers continued to light the candles night after night, decade after decade. By the 1930s, the phenomenon had become part of local folklore, stripped of its true history. Tourists would sometimes drive out to see the ghost lights of Western Grove, unaware of what they really were. During World War II, the vigil was briefly interrupted due to blackout regulations and fuel shortages, but it resumed in 1946. In the 1960s, During the height of the civil rights movement, a group of activists from Charleston attempted to turn Western Grove into a memorial site. They sought official recognition, historical markers, acknowledgement of what had happened there. The city council declined. The land remained in trust. The vigil continued, and the story stayed buried. Today, Western Grove is overgrown and forgotten by most. The ruins are barely visible beneath decades of vegetation. But if you were to travel to that lonely stretch of marshland outside Charleston, and if you were to arrive just after dusk, you would still see them. 17 lights moving through the darkness. Vigil that has continued unbroken for over 130 years. Not ghosts, not the supernatural. Memory, deliberate, defiant, unending. The lights still appear every night because someone somewhere refuses to let the world forget. This mystery shows us that the most haunting places are not those touched by the supernatural, but those marked by human cruelty and the silence that follows. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the vigil should continue, or should the past finally be allowed to rest? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, stories that uncover the hidden corners of history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.